Welcome to my channel. For my first video today, I wanted to talk about my favorite topic, which is fall, specifically fall reading. Fall is literally my favorite time of the year because I can really indulge myself in all of my favorite hobbies, and reading is obviously the main one. I just love how cozy fall is, and it's seriously the perfect time to pick up an atmospheric and immersive book, which are some of my favorites. Last year in September to December, I found some of my favorite reads of the entire year, and I've consistently found some of my favorite books in the fall to winter month. So I've built up quite a stack of recommendations for fall reads over the last few years. And so in today's video, I really wanted to discuss my fall book recommendations as well as a bit of my fall TBR for this year and some of the books I'm eyeing for the next couple of months. I've split these up into genres kind of loosely. I have fantasy, I have some romance, and I have miscellaneous, which is like literary fiction, historical fiction, and kind of like genre bending books or books that are multiple genres. We'll talk about those at the end. I'm gonna start out with fantasy because I feel like I have the most fantasy recommendations, and those tend to be my favorite books to reach for in the fall and winter, especially because usually in the summer I don't read as much fantasy, so by the time September hits, I'm kind of itching to get back into reading fantasy. I'm starting out with 3 of the most popular big fantasy series. I just have to recommend them, even though I'm sure most people have probably heard of them before. I just want to mention them anyways because there's a reason that they're so popular in my opinion. Okay, starting out with one of the most popular fantasy series of all time, I think, Harry Potter. I think most people are familiar with the series. It follows Harry Potter, who grows up living a pretty bleak existence until he finds out that he's actually a wizard, and he ends up going to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where he ends up meeting his 2 best friends and kind of learning how to hone his magical abilities. Throughout the series, we follow him on different quests, and eventually the culmination of everything, each book follows him in like a different year of school. It's perfect for the fall because it's kind of giving you those back to school vibes that I know a lot of people like reading about, not necessarily experiencing. And yeah, it's just really cozy and atmospheric. I also want to mention that I personally don't think these books are just for kids, even though the first 3 I think are classified as middle grade, maybe even more of them are classified as middle grade, but I think that these are perfect for anybody to read at any age. I read them when I was a kid. I think I've read them like 3 or 4 times now. Most recently, I just reread these last fall and loved them just as much, if not more. I think you can get so much out of these books at any age, and they're just like really fun to experience. If you haven't yet, I would highly recommend it, especially around now, this time of the year. Okay, next I'm recommending an author, and that's gonna be Sarah J. Maas. Personal recommendation is to start with ACOTAR. I think the fantasy plotline and world building is a little bit easier to follow than with Throne of Glass. ACOTAR is a lot heavier on the romance, so if you are coming from being a romance reader and you want to dive into fantasy, I think this is a really good place to start. So ACOTAR basically centers around Fae, and in this world, the Fae are separated into courts. That part of the book was so fun for me. That part of the series was so fun for me. I loved seeing all of the different courts, and like they all have different vibes and like aesthetics, and it was super fun to read about. And basically the like Fae realm is separated from the human realm in this world by a border, and our main character Feyre lives in a small town close to that border on the human world side. She ends up getting into some trouble with some of the Fae that have crossed over the border, and then that's kind of where the story starts. But that's kind of like the gist of the beginning part of the first book. The story develops so much more from there, and so many other things happen. There are 5 books out right now in this series. So my favorite parts about this series in particular were, like I said, the world and the world building I thought was really fascinating. I also loved the found family and the romance in these books. Those both stood out to me so much and were like the main reasons that I kept reading. This is coming from someone who's not like a very heavy romance reader. I just found the character building and all of that in these books to be so great. But yeah, this is great for people trying to get into fantasy, and I think this is the perfect time to start reading these books. Now getting into Throne of Glass, my opinion is that the series is a little bit better of a fantasy series overall. They both obviously have different pros and cons, but if you're looking for a really good fantasy story, I really love Throne of Glass for that. Throne of Glass follows our main character, Selena, and she is like, I think 18, maybe a little younger, around the start of the first book. And she is a prisoner at a like labor camp. And then she ends up getting invited to the castle, the king's castle, to compete on behalf of the prince in this like championship thing that the king is throwing. We don't really know any other details besides that at the very beginning of book 1, and that's where everything starts. I will say there's 8 books in this series, and so much more happens. If you read the first book and you're not hooked, the first book feels so separate from the rest of the series once you get past there. So really, like, truly just keep reading. It's incredible what the rest of the series will do, and it's such a ride. You have to just like trust the process, honestly. And in terms of reading order, I know it can be a little bit confusing and people have different opinions on which books you should read first and whatnot. My recommendation is to start with The Assassin's Blade, which is the prequel novellas. There's 5 novellas in here. I really, really, really strongly encourage you to start with this one before you dive into the actual like first book, which is Throne of Glass. That's how I read it, and I felt a lot more connected to the characters right off the bat when reading this. And there's some like subtle things that are talked about in this book that you find out later in the series anyways, but you would know already if you had already read this one, and it just like hits a little bit harder, I think. So I recommend that, but you can read it however you want. There's a lot of different ways online. But yeah, this series, I read it last fall, and it's just so perfect. I would classify ACOTAR as more romantasy and Throne of Glass as more fantasy. There is a romance, there's a few romances in Throne of Glass, but it's not a heavy plot line, which I kind of really like, especially in the fall. I really want like a fantasy. Okay, I have a few other like shorter fantasy series to discuss now. First, I have the Shepherd King duology by Rachel Gillig. The first book is One Dark Window, and the second book is Two Twisted Crowns. I also read this series last year for the first time and loved it so much. So this is an adult fantasy series, and it's like the perfect gothic fantasy world to dive into this fall. So in these books, we follow Elspeth, and ever since she was young, she has had a monster in her head that she calls the Nightmare. The world that she lives in has been infected with a dark magic that comes in the form of this fog that's like slowly overtaking a lot of the kingdom. And it's important to note that the people that are in this world don't have magical abilities. The form of magic in this series, the magic system, is really unique. It's in the form of cards, almost like tarot cards. Elspeth ends up getting dragged into the king's fight to combat the fog and the dark magic that's overtaking this land. They're like utilizing the cards to do that in certain ways, and you'll see how Elspeth fits into that. It's super fascinating. This world is so unique and this magic system is so unique. I haven't really read any other fantasy similar to this, and yeah, fall is like literally the perfect time to read. There is a little bit of a romance in these, but it's not the main focus at all. And yeah, it's just like super, super gothic and vibey and really, really great for fall. Okay, the next duology I have to recommend, I rarely see anyone talk about online. Like, I've seen a few people, but it's not a widely discussed series, and I can't believe that because I just love these books so much. I read them last fall again, and they were some of my favorite books I read through the whole year, and that's The Elements of Cadence by Rebecca Ross. That's A River Enchanted and A Fire Endless. This is the same author that wrote the Divine Rivals duology. So yeah, these are adult fantasy, and I think she actually wrote these before Divine Rivals. So I wouldn't necessarily classify these as like cozy fantasy, but they definitely feel a lot lower stakes than some of the other, like Throne of Glass. It's not like Throne of Glass. They feel a lot lower stakes, but they definitely do not feel like a cozy fantasy. They're kind of in that perfect in-between spot, which I love reading sometimes in the fall. I do love a higher stakes fantasy, but something like this is also really fun. So these books are set on the fictional island of Cadence. On this island, there's 2 groups of people, and they each kind of inhabit one half of the island, and they don't interact really. They are kind of like warring clans. You find out some of the history behind that throughout reading these, and that's really fascinating. I think Rebecca Ross took a lot of inspiration from, like, I think it was Scottish folklore, something like that. It kind of has that vibe when you read it. It has the like folky vibe, which is fun. The main plot follows Jack, who grew up on the island and then he traveled to the mainland for school. He's a musician and he was learning, I don't know, he was studying music on the mainland, and he gets called back when some little girls start to go missing. I'll also mention that music and musicians play a pretty important part in the magic system in this book. So that was why Jack was called back. And I also really enjoyed the setting of this book. Like, it was just very earthy and, again, pretty atmospheric, which I really enjoyed. There is romance in this as well, but it's not like the typical romance you would expect, and it's not a heavy plot of the book. Something I also loved was, like, even though there wasn't a heavy plot of romance, you could see the connections between all of the people on this island, because the community is pretty small and they're all pretty connected, and like the way they worked together and the relationships they have with each other were really beautiful and really, I don't know, fleshed out well. So yeah, these are some of my favorite fantasy reads. I can't recommend these enough, seriously. Go into it thinking that it's going to be more of a cozy fantasy though. If you go in with the mindset of like, this will be like Throne of Glass, you might get disappointed. These are meant to be lower stakes. I want to quickly recommend another fantasy trilogy. I'm just going to briefly recommend this one. I don't own the physical copy, so I'll just put up some photos, but that's the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber. I read these again last fall. The third and final book in the series had just come out last fall, so I like binge read the whole series, and it was so fun. These are YA. They're like a YA kind of romantasy, super fairy tale-esque, and it feels very romantic. Just like the world in general feels very romantic. The story feels very romantic. It feels like you're reading a fairy tale. Like, it's beautiful. In these books, we follow our main character, Evangeline. She makes a deal with the Prince of Hearts, and she ends up getting thrust on this like quest throughout the world with him. This quest lasts throughout the series. Really, it's just like a magical read. Like, it just feels super magical. They're not my favorite fantasy books of all time, but they're super fun, super enjoyable. Again, atmospheric, which I love for this time of the year, so I thought they were really fun. Okay, now I have a few fantasy standalones to recommend. The first one is one that I really don't hear anyone talk about, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's not my favorite fantasy book, but I thought it was really enjoyable, and I think it's a pretty good one for fall, and that's Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This book is set in a small village in a valley that's bordered by a enchanted forest, and this forest is full of dark magic that threatens the townspeople. The people of the village rely on the help of a wizard named the Dragon to protect them from like the sinister magic of the forest. But in order for the dragon to help the village, he requires a sacrifice, and that is that every 10 years he takes a young girl from the village to serve him. At the beginning of this book, it is the choosing, which is when the 10 years is up for the last girl, so he comes to pick a new one, and our main character gets chosen to serve him. I would say this book is actually surprisingly darker than I was expecting it to be, so go into it kind of expecting that. I didn't go into it expecting that. I was kind of expecting like a cozy fun time, which it does feel cozy and it is a fun time, but it was a lot darker. Like the magic system and stuff was a lot darker than I originally thought, but it was very unique and very interesting to read about. So it's one I would definitely recommend checking out this season if you want. Okay, last for fantasy, Erin Morgenstern. She's the author of The Night Circus and The Starless Sea. I'm recommending both of these books. Although The Night Circus, I won't discuss too much because I read this book probably 7 years ago, and I remember really enjoying it at the time, but it's actually one I want to reread this fall if possible. So I'll recommend it because I remember enjoying it, but I don't have too much else to say on it. Maybe after I reread it, I'll talk about it more. But for The Starless Sea, I just read this one last winter, almost 2 years ago, but recent enough. So this book follows Zachary, who is a like grad student at university, and one day in his library he finds a like mysterious book that he starts reading, and he finds out that this book has actually chronicled like parts of his childhood, and he's really desperate to figure out why this book has chronicled his life. And along this quest to discover the mystery of this book, he meets some interesting people, sees some interesting things. I don't really want to say too much more than that about this book because it is one that I think going in knowing not that much just adds to your experience. So it's one I would recommend checking out, and it's very atmospheric, and it kind of, there's like a genre of books, I don't know what this would fit into, but kind of like mysterious fantasy where you as the reader don't know what's going on either, and you're figuring it out at the same time as the main character is. I love books like that, and this is part of that genre. And I think The Night Circus is like that as well, from what I remember, kind of like mysterious, but in a really like fun and magical way. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. But let's move on to romance recommendations now. I want to start with one of my favorite Halloween romances, and that's The Ex-Hex by Erin Sterling. If you want to read a book that kind of gives you the same vibes as like Halloween Town or like Salem in Hocus Pocus, that is what this book did for me. When I was reading it, I was literally just thinking about those movies the entire time. And it was so fun. I thought the romance was pretty good as well. There's like this minor plot where the two main characters, the female and male main characters, have to like help save the town from some sort of like dark magic. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember loving the vibe overall, and the romance was good. It wasn't anything like crazy, but it's just like, it'll get you into the Halloween mood if you read it in October. It's just fun for that. So that's why I'm recommending it. Next, I want to recommend Ashley Poston, specifically two of her books, A Novel Love Story and The 7-Year Slip. Both of these are romance books, but they also both have magical realism in it, which is kind of like Ashley Poston's specialty, I think. Most of her books have that. So you get that kind of cozy fantasy elements with like a really cool plot line usually, and some like good romance. Out of the two of these, I loved both of them so much, honestly. I think I rated them the same, like almost a 5-star, 4.5, 4.75. So I loved both, but they have completely different vibes, completely different storylines. They are not set in the same world. So The 7-Year Slip, it's set in New York City, and it follows our main character who goes to live in her aunt's apartment after her aunt died. And this apartment has magic where sometimes when she enters the apartment, it'll take her back in time 7 years to like what was going on in the apartment 7 years ago. And through that, she meets a man that was living at her aunt's apartment 7 years prior. They kind of start a romance through that, and then she has to find him in present day, and there's kind of, you know, things that happen because of that. And I thought it was really fun. It's a really just like fun, easy read. And in A Novel Love Story, we follow our main character who's part of this romance book club, and every year her and the other people in this book club will go to this cabin and just like read and chill together for a week. And this year she's the only one that can go, so she ends up going alone just because she really needs to. She really needs the time away. And on the way she hits some bad weather, and she ends up needing to stop in a town, and she realizes very quickly that this town that she stopped in is the fictional town from her favorite romance series. And yeah, both of these books are so cozy and so fun and just like perfect to read in the fall, I think. And yeah, I honestly loved them so much, and I'm not a huge romance reader, so it takes a lot for me to like love a romance, but these were just a really cozy, fun time, honestly. And the last like fall romance book I have to recommend is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. I also loved this one. It's about this girl who is a witch, but she is taught to keep her powers a secret. Instead, what she does is she goes on like the internet, on TikTok or something, and makes videos as a witch, just like videos about witchy things, and she kind of grows a following through that. And one day she gets a message from someone asking if she can come up to this remote house called the Nowhere House and teach these young witches how to use their magic and powers. And she's like, how did you know that I was a real witch? But she ends up going to this house anyways, and she meets the kids, and she meets the other people, like the adults that take care of the kids, and you really just see how they all kind of become this like found family together. And there is a romance in here as well, obviously. It's a romance book. And the romance was so cute and so wholesome. This was just like, yeah, it was a really cozy, wholesome read. And it doesn't necessarily give off fall vibes, except for the fact that it's about witches, but it's not like set in the fall, I don't think. It's just like cozy. Oh wait, I have one more romance author that I want to recommend. I don't own the physical copies, so I'll have to put them up on the screen, but that's Devney Perry, and you might have heard of her from her Eden series, which I would recommend that one as well. I've read the whole series, and it was not like my favorite thing ever, but it's just like a small town romance series. It's good for splitting up between other books that you're reading. I thought they were enjoyable. They were like fine, but I want to recommend her newest series. The first book is called Crossroads, and I surprisingly loved this book so much, and it wasn't for the romance. Like, I thought the romance was good, but in this book, they're like renovating this mountain resort, and like the two main characters are doing that together, and it was so good. I don't know what it was about this book, but like I ate it up. That mountain resort lodge thing, I was just like, give me more. I don't know, it was so good though. So I'm recommending that one specifically because the second book in the series, called Sunlight, is coming out in October. So if you want to get into the series, now's the time. So I'll recommend those as well, because it was a more recent read for me. I just read Crossroads like a couple months ago, and it just hit in a way that I didn't expect it to. So if you want to read it, it's not specifically fall or Halloween themed like some of the other ones are, but it was just good. Okay, so lastly for my recommendations, the last category is miscellaneous. It's like literary fiction, historical fiction, magical realism is in here, but it's like, it wasn't fantasy enough for me to include in fantasy in my opinion, but we'll get there. The first one I have to recommend is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I really loved this book. People compare this a lot of the time to The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I would also recommend, but if we're comparing the two, I think this one is better. I just had a better time reading it. I was more invested in the characters. I liked the characters more in this one, but they do have similarity. It follows a group of 7 students that are in this like prestigious theater program at university, and in this program they only do Shakespeare. They only study Shakespeare's plays. There's a mystery in this book, and it's also like a really interesting character study into all 7 of these characters, and it's like genuinely the epitome of dark academia. If you want to read that, this is a really great one. If you haven't checked it out yet, I would recommend it for the fall. Okay, switching the vibe completely now. This is Circe. This one is like one of my favorite books I've ever read in my life. This one's kind of a mix of genres. It's obviously like a Greek mythology retelling. It's kind of literary, and it has, you know, the like magical elements of Greek mythology. It follows Circe throughout her life. If you're not familiar with her story, you do not have to be going into this. I knew nothing about her mythology surrounding this character. I knew nothing about it going into this, and I did not struggle at all. Madeline Miller explains it all in a really nice way, I think, and it's obviously a retelling, so things are not always accurate. But the reason I think this one is great for fall is because it follows Circe, who's actually a witch. She's born with this witchcraft, and she is able to display her powers. Zeus gets threatened because she's so powerful and banishes her to this deserted island to like live out the rest of her life there. And while we're on this island with her, we see a bunch of different mythical figures that come and visit her. We see all the things she does on her own and like the character growth that she experiences. And I personally got super attached to her throughout the story because we're following her so in depth throughout her life and throughout this really like vulnerable experience that she's having. I think this is perfect for autumn because Circe is a witch, so she uses a lot of like earth elements for her magic. She's really, really connected to the land. Yeah, it feels very like earthy and cozy, which I love this time of year, and a lot of these books are kind of like that. It has a similar vibe, just like a general overall vibe to the Elements of Cadence River Enchanted series as well. So that's maybe why I liked both of these. I don't know. Okay, next I'm recommending Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This is a historical fiction story that follows Shakespeare's family in the 1500s, and it's set in like the English countryside. This book covers many different topics, including marriage and grief. Obviously, it's about his son Hamnet that dies, and it's kind of about the events leading up to that and how it affects everyone else after, and it's really so beautiful, honestly. This was such an incredible read, and I read it like over 2 years ago, and it's stuck with me so long. Like, I've never forgotten this. It's one that I think about like every day. Okay, and my last recommendation is my favorite book of all time. I recommend this book to everyone in my life. I love this book so much. If you take one recommendation from this video, please let it be this book. Seriously, it's so good. And that's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I recommend this book without telling you anything about it, just because I think going into this knowing nothing is how you get the most out of it and how you will enjoy it the most. So I recommend just going in. You can read the back, it doesn't really tell you that much. But just like go in and read it. You're seriously in for such a ride. If I could reread this book for the first time, I would. Like, I love it so much. Seriously, read it like 3 years ago and nothing has topped it for me. No book that I've read in the last 3 years has surpassed this in my mind. It's the best book I've ever consumed, and I can't recommend it enough. So yeah, if you take one recommendation from this video, please let it be this one. It's so good. Okay, so that was all for my recommendations, and now I want to quickly get into my TBR and all of the books that I want to read this fall. I'm very meticulous with which books I put on my fall and winter TBRs because I'm looking to craft a very specific vibe here. I don't know, we'll see how it goes this fall. Last fall I had some of my best reading of all time, so we'll see how this fall goes, but I have a lot of high hopes for the books that I have on here. So I'm gonna start with a book I've actually already read, but it was on my fall TBR. I just finished it, and that's The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah. So I read Firefly Lane in August and I loved it so much I knew I needed to read a few more of her books. And the next one I wanted to pick up was The Great Alone because I've just heard really good things about it. And I read it and it was really great. It was great. So this was on my fall TBR, but I read it. Okay, the next book on my list is one that I just started. I've read one chapter, but that's Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. This is the same author as The House in the Cerulean Sea, which I read last summer, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was just like a cozy time. So I'm hoping for the same of this out of this one. As I said, I'm already currently reading it, so we'll see how I feel about it when I'm done. Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I've heard really good things about this one like recently, and I wasn't in the fantasy mood really in the summer, so it feels like September is a good time to read this. I know it's more like Regency, Bridgerton-esque fantasy. I kind of have heard like a little bit of the plot of this one, but I don't know too much, so I'm excited. If that's the vibe that it actually exudes, I'll be very happy. I love Bridgerton, and I think this will be just like a cozy, just like a lighthearted fantasy, you know. Another fantasy is Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young. This is the same author as The Unmaking of June Farrow, which I haven't read, but I think I'd really enjoy that one too. I haven't really heard anything about this one, but the back sounds really interesting and it sounds like something I'd really love as well. So I kind of want to read this one first because I think this was like published before The Unmaking of June Farrow, if I'm not mistaken. And I also think she has another book in this like world. I don't know. I don't think they're connected, but they're all kind of, they have the same type of covers, you know. I think she has another one coming out soon. I don't know when, but we'll see how I feel about this one. If I like this one, I might also read The Unmaking of June Farrow. We'll see. But this one sounds interesting to me. I'm going to try to get to this soon because I'm definitely heading back into my fantasy era. So, okay, I have a literary fiction, and that is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. I read Beartown 2 years ago, and I haven't continued the series, but I really want to, and I haven't read anything else by him, although I loved Beartown so much. So I've recently been hearing a lot about this book, and I'm just curious. It sounds like nothing I've ever read. It's about like a hostage situation or something. I don't know. I've heard that it's funny. It has it's a Netflix series as well. So this might be used to break up some of my other, I don't know, maybe like heavier reads that I have planned for this fall. We'll see when I actually get to this one, but I'm very intrigued. Okay, I actually have 2 more Kristin Hannah books, so I'll talk about them together. The first one, I've heard no one talk about this. I have a very specific reason for wanting to read this in the fall, which I'll tell you, but that's True Colors by Kristin Hannah. First of all, I love this cover so much. The colors and the horse, I don't know, I love it. The reason I wanted to read this book is because I saw the cover and I read the back, and it sounds exactly like this show that I used to watch when I was a kid. If you're Canadian and you've heard of this show, maybe it's not just Canadians, but I know it's set in Canada and it was on CBC when I was a kid. That's how I watched this, and it's called Heartland. If you watched Heartland or you know what Heartland is, please let me know. I feel like maybe it's not that niche. Maybe I'm thinking it's niche and it's not, but like I've never heard anyone else talk about Heartland. This book just sounds like Heartland in a book, and Heartland is such a cozy like fall winter show to me. So this really just sounds like that. It's set on like a ranch and there's like drama between some like family and stuff on this ranch. That's literally Heartland. So I'm sure this won't be like that at all, but if it is, I'll be very happy because Heartland, it was such a throwback for me. I literally want to rewatch Heartland this fall just because I read the back of this book. Okay, the next Kristin Hannah that I want to read is The Nightingale. Everyone loves this book. I feel like I haven't heard anyone say that they don't like this book. I know it's set in World War II, and I know it makes everyone cry, so that's what I'm expecting. Every other, like the other two Kristen Hanna books that I've read have also made me cry, so I'm expecting nothing less from this one, honestly. I'm very intrigued, and I'm actually really excited. I love a good emotional historical fiction every so often, so I'm definitely gonna get to this one this fall as well. The Book of Doors, I actually know nothing about this other than what I read on the back, and when I read the back of it, it actually sounded kind of similar to The Starless Sea to me, like kind of that mystery fantasy. If it's like that, I don't know if it's actually like that, but if it is like that, oh, it says for readers of The Midnight Library, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, The Night Circus. So maybe it is like that. I've read all 3 of those books. I think I'll really enjoy this one. I'm very, very interested and excited to get to this one. And I don't have that much fantasy on my list, so I'm relying on these couple of fantasy books. Okay, the last 2 fantasy on my list, I have A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. So I already mentioned Uprooted by Naomi Novik, but I've read nothing else by this author. I really liked her writing, and I've heard great things. This is a trilogy, and I know it's set at like a magical school. Love that. So I'll for sure be getting to this fall. And then I have Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. I've never seen this cover on this book before. I've heard about this book for a long time. This is the same author as Coraline, and Coraline is literally my favorite movie to watch in the fall. I watch it all year, but I specifically watch it in the fall. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. So I don't think I would read the Coraline book though. I prefer the movie, so I don't think I need to read the book. But I know that this book is really well known. And I'm really interested. So I think it's a children's book technically, but it was in the adult fantasy section at my bookstore. So I think that means to me that although it might be written for kids, adults would probably like it too. And this one's illustrated, which is super fun. So I think this could be like a quicker read. It has really beautiful illustrations actually. So yeah, I'm very intrigued by this one. If it gives me like Halloween vibes, that'll be perfect. I'm planning to read it sometime in October. So I only have 3 books left on my like physical TBR, and 2 of them are romance. We already talked about both of these authors, so I'll just quickly mention The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. I've obviously read her other 2 books. I haven't read this one yet, and I would like to because I liked both of her other books quite a lot. So this is another one I'll probably read. And then The Kiss Curse by Erin Sterling. This is, I think it's the second book after the Ex-Hex, but I don't think you need to read them in order. But it's set in the same town. I think it's going to give me the same like Halloween-y vibes. So I definitely want to get to this. And I know that she has a 3rd book in the series coming out, but that one seems more Christmassy. It's called The Wedding Witch, I think. So I might save that one for December. I think it comes out in October, but I'll save it for December if it's Christmas vibes. And lastly is a classic, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I have always known about this book. I think it is a popular classic. I don't know. And I think it's gonna be like more spooky, so I'll save it for October. I know nothing about it. Like the back, when you read the back, it gives you nothing. So yeah, we'll see, but I'm very interested. I want to read more classics this year. I only read 1 classic this year, and my goal was to read 5. So okay, and then I do just want to mention a couple of books that are not on my physical TBR that I would love to get to this fall. A few of them are newer releases, but okay, the first one is Frankenstein. I think I'll listen to the audiobook of this one. I've been meaning to read Frankenstein for years, and now feels like a good time to do so. So I'll try and get to that one in October as well. I think I'll enjoy it. I've heard really great things. I mean, it's another classic, but I've heard amazing things about it. So, and then I have 3 new releases that I'm gonna try to get to this fall. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but okay, well, I already mentioned The Wedding Witch and Sunlight by Devney Perry, so I only have 2 others. I have Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I'll for sure be getting to that one this fall. It comes out at the end of September, I think. So I'm probably, I don't know if I'll read it right when I get it, but I'll read it at some point. And then The Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. It's like a novella by the same author as If We Were Villains. So I think this is like the only other book she's come out with since If We Were Villains, which it's been like years since that book came out. So I'm very intrigued. It's, like I said, it's just a little short novella, but I'm definitely going to be reading that. I have a couple books like here and there that I'm thinking about possibly reading in the fall, but we'll see how much I actually get to. That's like a pretty big TBR. So, but yeah, that's the end of the video. Those are all of my recommendations and my TBR. Hopefully you got some recommendations somewhere in this video. But yeah, this was the end of my first video, and if you guys liked it, I would love it if you would subscribe. I have a lot of ideas for future videos, reading vlogs, etc. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching.